Welcome to this cold, rainy afternoon and looking at assessment centres. So this is number 6 in our series of the webinars. So hopefully you've joined us on some or all of the previous webinars, and if not, and this is your first time joining us, then welcome also. If you have missed any of the other ones and you want to go back and have a look at them, then you're very welcome to go and check out our YouTube channel where we've uploaded one from each week, so you'll be able to find those there. We've also recently, I think yesterday, uploaded all of the tasks for each of the webinars as well, so they're on their own little playlist. So you're welcome to pop over to YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel and you'll get the alerts for each of the webinars. But this is where it fits in, week 6, and then we've got another couple of topics to do afterwards in the next couple of weeks. So if this is the first time joining us, we'll just go through a few sort of guidelines for the webinars to get the most from them. So key thing, definitely be present and participate. I think we're quite a small group this afternoon, but that gives you even more chance to ask some questions. If you do want to ask a question, you can ask it at any point using the chat function within the Zoom program. So use chat rather than, I think we've disabled Q&A, but use chat. And if you can set any questions to all panelists and all attendees, that means everyone gets to see them and gets to see the answers. So that would be cool. Don't be shy, feel free to ask questions. If you want to ask questions at the end, that's fine as well. And we will just do a quick summary if there's any questions at the end. If you can just knock any notifications off on your phone so that we can retain your attention throughout the webinar. And then finally, if you can just make use of the tools that are available. So we've got a load of resources to give to you at the end of this webinar to refer you to. And of course, your career service, the biggest resource of all, who we will keep mentioning in every single webinar because we think career services are doing wonderful things. And if you haven't already, go and find out what they're able to offer you. So a little bit about us, if you haven't come across us before. So I am Sophie, looking considerably more windswept and less groomed than my picture this afternoon. And I'm MD at SRS. We work with employers and universities within graduate recruitment. So we design assessment materials for big employers and support them with the recruitment of their graduates. We also do a lot of work with universities to run assessment centre simulations. I've also written the book From Learner to Earner, which this webinar series is based upon. I'm very sociable and active on the platforms you can see there. If you haven't already connected to me on your favourite platform, please do. It's been lovely to receive sort of LinkedIn requests and see follows here and there from the people that have seen the webinars. We've loved reading your comments and feedback on, I think we've seen more on LinkedIn, a few on Twitter and things. So thank you for those. It's really kind to see that they're being well received, so thank you. Helen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, someone's just put a comment saying they've just bought your book. Looking forward to having a proper look at it. Isn't that nice?
No, that's so lovely. And I'd love to know what you think of it, and especially if you like it, if you can leave a review on Amazon, that would be really cool. But, that's exciting. Or do a post with your book. I love seeing the pictures of the books. That's really cool, definitely. So yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, here we are again. I'm Helen, University Partnerships Manager, working with Sophie to run these webinars, assessment centres, employability workshops. Again, hope you find this webinar really useful. Feel free to post any questions throughout the webinar. Just a reminder, if you can set the chat function to all panellists and attendees so that everyone can see your comments. Otherwise, it might look a bit strange if I'm responding to a question that no one else can see. But thanks very much.
Great, cheers Helen. So as always, in each of the webinars, we are joined by experts in graduate recruitment to hear their valuable insight and top tips. Today, we have some advice from Helen Alkin. Helen is currently Head of Future Talent at British Airways, and before that was in a similar role at Marks & Spencer's, so very experienced and knowledgeable. She's also a board member at the Institute of Student Employers, which you may have heard us mention in various webinars. So she's got loads of useful knowledge and experience to share with us. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today, it's definitely a clear focus on assessment centres. And you know, preparing for an interview alone can be a daunting prospect, but when an employer invites you to attend an assessment centre, sometimes knowing where to start and what to expect can be downright nerve-wracking. So you can see on the screen there that we're going to cover what to expect, in-person and digital assessment centres, and the different types of exercises that you will encounter. Now, you will all have different experiences of assessment centres. Some of you will never have attended one before. Some of you may have attended them before and even been offered a placement or a job, or you've been unsuccessful. So you're all at slightly different points in terms of your own experiences. So some of you may want to come back and revisit some of the information because it's very new, and that's cool. You will get sent the recording. So before we get stuck in, we're going to hear from our expert Helen about why employers use assessment centres.
Assessment centres are specifically designed to use a variety of tests and exercises to assess a range of different skills, and it's quite unusual for one candidate to perform brilliantly on every exercise. Inevitably, some exercises will suit you more than others, and I remember plenty of examples in our wash-up meetings where the business decided to hire a candidate who had underperformed on one exercise but recovered to show their potential on the others. We used a competency scoring grid for this very reason. If you didn't do a great job communicating during a written exercise, for example, we would also assess your communication skills during the interview and the group exercise, giving you multiple chances to impress.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So Helen gave us a bit of an insight there as to why employers use assessment centres. And simply put, employers use assessment centres to gain as much information as possible about how a candidate is likely to perform on the job. Through a number of activities, they assess a candidate's skills, knowledge, and behavioural fit for the organisation. They're held either at an employer's offices, a hotel, or a training facility, so make sure you check the location and plan your journey accordingly. Clearly, with the current crisis, most employers, well, all employers that are still hiring at the moment, are using virtual or digital assessment centres, and we will be discussing the differences between each of these later. Assessment centres are hosted over half a day or a full day, depending on the role and industry, and you'll usually be joined by several other candidates, so typically between 6 and 12. It's important to balance being a team player with showcasing your own performance. You'll be required to work both as an individual and as part of a group on a number of activities, which could include case studies, presentations, analytical exercises, one-to-one or panel interviews, group exercises, role plays, skills or written tests, and maybe even psychometric tests as well. You're likely to complete three or four activities that I've just mentioned during the assessment centre, and a typical assessment day might look like this. You can see on the screen here that this is a full day assessment centre, and what we're tending to see with digital assessment centres is they tend to be half a day, so a bit less kind of waiting around time that you might see at a in-person assessment centre. You'll probably be introduced to assessors who would be recruiters or managers from within the organisation, and these assessors will score your performance against a competency or strengths-based framework. The assessors are going to be looking for you to show a variety of key skills, strengths or competencies during the assessment centre. So every activity will be focused on your ability to demonstrate these successfully. Broadly speaking, each strength will be assessed at least twice over the course of the assessment centre, with some organisations prioritising some strengths or competencies over others, such as motivational fit, for example. You can see on the screen here, I've identified the most common skills that employers look for. Often assessors will discuss all aspects of a candidate's performance before making a decision, and the outcome's generally decided once all of the assessment centres have taken place, so don't expect to hear from them for at least a couple of weeks. Usually the employer will inform you of when you should expect to hear back, and if they haven't, then do get in touch and ask them when that might be. Make sure that you ask for feedback, especially if you aren't successful, because this is going to help you to identify what you need to work on in preparation for the next assessment centre. We're going to hear from Helen again now.
It's possible to bomb on one exercise but still pass the day. The whole aim of an assessment centre, when it works effectively, is to allow a range of assessors to see the candidate in a variety of exercises. The wash-up then allows the scores to be reviewed and a discussion to take place that really teases out and considers how that candidate performed across the whole day. Typically, some exercises hold more weight than others too.
Okay, thank you. I think it's really important to note what Helen says there around it being possible to fail at one exercise and being successful. I always have a really strong example in my mind of where I've seen an exercise go badly and I've seen people respond to it in a different way. So when I was responsible for graduate recruitment at John Lewis, there was an assessment centre that we ran one day it was in Cheadle, Manchester, and there was this group activity that we used to do, and I can't remember the exact detail of it, but it was something where they had to do a load of calculations that then build a bridge that then equated to some sort of profit at the end of the task. So that was kind of what it was. Group exercise, and typically they would end up, a normal group would end up with something like 20 or 30,000 pounds in profit at the end of the activity. And this is one of the secrets with group exercises, is usually the outcome's not that important, because what the assessors are assessing is how you behave and communicate within the exercise itself. Anyway, in this particular exercise, the candidates absolutely bombed. It was disastrous. So they actually ended up with minus money at the end of it, which is the first and only time I've ever seen that as an outcome. And the group handled it really differently, and there were two girls that I remember in particular. One of them took it in her stride, kind of wrote it off to bad experience, but behaved really well, led the group and all sorts of things within the exercise. So even though the outcome was poor, she just got on with it, and she scored all right in that exercise, and she didn't let it distract her from the rest of the day. There was another girl who disappeared at lunchtime, which was straight after this exercise had finished. And I went to look for her, and I found her in the car park crying on the phone to her mum. And she was really upset because obviously it had gone wrong and she thought she'd failed everything, and she just wanted her mum to come and pick her up. And luckily I was able to persuade her to come back in, because it was still worth finishing off the day. I kind of suspected that she wouldn't be successful, but I thought if it can get her to finish the day, she'll at least get some feedback from the day, and that will be useful for whatever she does next. So she did come back in, and she just, credit to her, she did finish the day, but that had thrown her, and she wasn't great. And I just think it's really interesting to just reflect on two people in the same exercise with the same outcome of that particular exercise, but then the first girl did pass the day, and clearly the second didn't. So just re-emphasizing Helen's point there around you can fail one task and still pass the day. So let's look at some of the key exercises now that you might face during an assessment centre. Now, there is a lot of information coming up now, because we're going to cover each of these in some detail. So it might be that you come back to this part of the webinar in your own time, just to make sure you capture everything you need to. If you completed the pre-task, which was in the video with the link to this session, you can pay particular focus to the exercises which you know that you're more likely to complete. If you didn't complete the task, don't worry about it, that's fine, but you might want to have another look at that after the webinar. So we're going to have a look at group exercises first of all. So these usually involve between 4 and 8 candidates, depending on the number of candidates that are attending the assessment centre. The employer will provide an industry or workplace related problem that requires a solution. Candidates are assessed against criteria designed to identify key competencies, including teamwork, leadership, enthusiasm, persuasiveness, problem solving, critical thinking, communication, and possibly commercial awareness. Some typical group exercises, you can see some examples on the screen there. So icebreakers, tend to find those at the beginning of the day, aimed at relaxing candidates and building team spirit. Quite a popular activity. And you might be asked to complete something really random, such as building a tower from straws and paper, or balancing an egg on some sort of contraption. With group discussions, you'll be given a scenario and asked to reach a logical conclusion. Usually candidates will be asked to lead the discussion in turn, or there'll be an opportunity to do so. With case studies, you'll be provided with a role to play based on background information and a brief. One common example can be a mock meeting where each candidate assumes a specific function and is expected to fulfill individual and group objectives. Have you come across Belbin team roles, anyone? That can be quite an interesting thing to take a look at if you haven't already come across it. I know at university sometimes it's quite popular to cover this within a module. So Dr. Meredith Belbin and his team discovered that there are 9 clusters of behaviour which have been named the Belbin team roles that enable a team to be high performing. I've worked with students who assumed that because they're not an extrovert or naturally creative, that they're not good in a teamwork situation. But actually, once they've understood which of the Belbin team roles they fell into, then had a greater understanding of their role, increased confidence, and a better idea of how they could contribute. If you want to understand your role within a team better, take a look at the Belbin website. The link for this is listed in the resource section at the end of this webinar. Some top tips here for group exercises. So make sure that you get involved. So make your points clearly and confidently. Don't criticise, interrupt or undermine others, but do politely intervene if someone is dominating the group, which is something we quite often see in a group exercise. Follow the instructions carefully, relating everything back to the brief. Identify a timekeeper and a note taker if there's an opportunity to do that. Involve other candidates, especially those who are quieter and more reserved. Delegate appropriately, choosing the best person for each task. Praise and show appreciation for others, so build upon their comments when possible also. Stand up for your opinion if criticised, putting forward relevant facts, and remain calm but work quickly and decisively. Case studies up next, and you can see some examples of the types of questions you might see in those. So case studies are often used by consulting and accountancy organisations in particular. They will test your analytical skills, your problem solving skills, and your creativity. The employer will describe a situation and you'll need to respond with advice in the form of a report or verbal explanation. And you then reach your conclusion by collating and analysing provided information. Some case study top tips here for you. So justify your answers and defend your decisions. Analyse the issue by looking for patterns, inconsistencies and contradictions. Manage your time carefully, which is important in every exercise. Pay attention to detail. Read all the instructions and materials before you start to understand what's expected of you. And treat the task like a course assignment. Arrange all of your material and then draw your conclusions. Presentations. I often think presentations are the exercise that people fear the most. That and role plays, I reckon. They would be on my list, I think, of all of them. But presentations assess your ability to communicate clearly with your audience. The skills that are being tested here could include timing, engagement, creativity, and the ability to deliver a message. They usually last between 10 and 20 minutes with an opportunity for the assessors to ask questions. Employers might ask you to prepare your presentation in advance, or you might be given the topic on the day and a short time to prepare. Here are a few examples of presentation topics that you might come across. So if you're asked to present on your background, you might be asked specifically things like, tell us about an achievement that you're particularly proud of, why do you want to apply to us, or why should we hire you, and be asked to present on those things. If you're looking at a company focused topic, you could be asked things such as, how would you improve our business strategy over the next 5 years? What do you think are the main challenges you may face in this role? Or carry out a SWOT analysis on our organisation, or something around bringing a new product to market and being asked to present your strategy. Few ideas here about how to prepare a presentation. So it's important to start off focusing on the key aims and objectives of the topic and tailor your presentation accordingly. Ensure that you have structure. This is so important, just to make sure that there's a clear structure. So include an introduction, a main section, and then a conclusion. Show evidence of further research throughout your presentation, referring to the sources that you've used as part of your research. Consider using reading cards to remember key messages and figures. Keep information relevant and succinct, so use bullet points and short sentences. That will help you to stay on topic. And if possible, use visual aids, flip charts, PowerPoint, handouts, or something more creative as well. That would be good to keep your audience engaged. Practice out loud beforehand and time yourself. be prepared for questions, because there will probably be questions. Just a point on the timing: whenever we see presentations in assessment centres, they do tend to be, they tend to not make full use of the time rather than overrun. Sometimes you do see people overrunning, but usually they don't make the full use of time. And it tends to be that when you're nervous, you speak a bit faster. So do practice it and make sure that you can make use of the time that's available. A few presentation top tips there. So smile and engage with your audience. I've said it in a previous webinar, but smiling is one of the key things to do at any point in the recruitment process, because whenever you can smile, and same with giving eye contact, it really does just help you to engage with the audience and to build rapport with your assessors. So with the eye contact, don't just focus on your notes if you're using them. Do try and give some eye contact. Keep calm and breathe. Speak clearly and not too fast, like I just said. Vary the tone and the pitch of your voice, so just a bit more interesting. Don't fidget and be conscious of your body language. Everyone, when nervous or when doing a presentation, has got some kind of nervous tick. So work out what yours is and try to reduce it as much as possible. And then finally, just manage your time effectively there. Next up, in-tray, e-tray exercises. So sometimes these are known as inbox exercises or e-tray exercises if completed digitally. And this type of exercise will require you to organise a workload. It can assess key competencies such as analytical skills, decision-making, time management, accuracy, organisation, and communication skills. These exercises usually take around 30 to 60 minutes to work through and will require you to explore 10 to 30 items of paperwork such as emails, letters, memos, minutes, reports, organisation charts, policy documents, and telephone messages. The task is usually to prioritise these items and then explain the action that is required for each. You may be asked to respond to queries, draft replies, make decisions, or delegate tasks. You may also be given new material throughout the exercise. It's quite common to see that. To be successful in this kind of exercise, ensure that you know how you'll be assessed. Also check whether you can write on the documents. Clearly this is going to be for an in-person event, but it can be helpful to make notes on the documents, but you must just check whether that's acceptable, because they may be reusing them. Note any actions that you've got in bullet form, so pay attention to detail and referring to the material provided. Be prepared to justify your decisions. Read all the instructions and accompanying materials carefully before starting, and then make a rough plan based on any key issues. Work quickly, accurately, systematically, and logically. Just a point there that I've just kind of thought of as I'm running through those is when you're doing a digital assessment centre in particular, it would be really helpful just to have a notepad to hand, because I guess that's the kind of thing that usually gets provided at an in-person one. So if you're doing them digitally at the moment, a notepad, make sure you've got that so you're not scrapping around trying to find some paper. Role plays, I think these are my least favourite as a candidate. Quite fun as an assessor though, especially if you're the one that's playing the role. So role plays, they're often used to assess candidates who are applying for customer-facing positions or management roles, and typically these are conducted one-to-one between a candidate and an assessor, but sometimes an actor is used and the assessor would just observe. The types of skills assessed can be communication, leadership, negotiation, and persuasion. And you can often identify the skills that have been assessed by the topic that you've been asked to role play. So for example, if the scenario is based on selling something, then the assessor could be looking at your ability to influence and negotiate. Some top tips here for the role play. So stay relaxed and keep calm. Be yourself and behave how you would if the scenario were real. So that's what they're looking to assess at any point during the assessment day. So do try and act as you would, rather than kind of putting on a bit of a front with it. Try to speak clearly and not rush through it. Engage with the person role playing with you, so keep eye contact and again smile, particularly if it's a challenging role play. And role plays are often sort of a situation with conflict or challenge within them. And if you're smiling and maintaining eye contact, it's a bit easier to disarm the other person. Do some research on the role during your preparation time, and again, keep to time. So skills or written tasks, this kind of exercise usually involves writing an essay, an email, a letter, or a report on a given topic, though you may sometimes be asked to proofread, review, or summarise a document. These exercises typically take between 40 and 60 minutes. They assess your common sense, reading comprehension, and written communication. I've got some top tips. I've just spotted someone's raised their hand there. If you could just put whatever question you've got in the chat box, that would be great. So some skills, tasks, top tips here. Ensure that you read all the instructions and materials carefully. Use a combination of headings, bullet points, and writing styles to add emphasis. Use acronyms only after you've explained them. Use correct spelling and grammar, and write for someone that doesn't have your knowledge, which again is why you should only use acronyms after you've explained them. Results from a recent Institute of Student Employers survey have shown that 60% of graduate employers have moved their assessment centres online now. And it's worth getting to grips with what's involved, as even after this pandemic, we think that it's unlikely that employers will entirely revert back to in-person events. We think it will be a combination of both. We've seen an increase in employers using digital assessment centres, or DACs as we've been calling them. And Helen's now just going to talk us through what these are and how these differ to in-person assessment centres. Helen, over to you.
Thank you. So let's first have a look at what's the same between digital assessment centres and the in-person events. You okay to click on Sophie there? Yeah. So firstly, it's important to remember that you'll be assessed against the same criteria as you would have been in person, and in most cases the same materials are used. Don't assume that you won't have to take part in a group exercise, as this can and is still being done online by employers. Secondly, you still need to do the same level of preparation, and whereas before you would have researched the location and planned your travel arrangements, you're now going to use this time instead to practice with the technology. And we'll go on to talk about some tips in this area. As before, a lot of employers issue pre-advice and briefings before attending their assessment centres, and so it's still important for you to review these and check things like the dress code, for example. So what's different about digital assessment centres? For starters, employers are very much aware that they need to take individual circumstances into account. For example, some candidates may have to complete the assessment centre in a shared room or with a poor internet connection. Now, a good employer will make provision for this, with some even supplying equipment to help or doing a phone call instead wherever possible. They are stepping up the communication with candidates and ask that you are very honest with them. They want to see you at your best. And so, for example, if the time you're given is just not right, because you might have other people wanting to use the laptop, etc., then please tell them. I spoke to one assessor who recently ran an assessment centre where the woman had a young child sleeping in the next room. So the candidate made the assessor aware of what could happen and actually completed half of the interview with the child on her lap. She actually still passed the process because of the preparation she'd done beforehand. In terms of what else is different, it can be harder to make a connection with the assessor because you can't do things like a handshake. However, there are ways you can still build this relationship, and it's still important to have that bit of light chat with the assessor before you begin the exercise. It also becomes even more important to smile, nod, and use your hands to emphasise key points. In particular, make sure you're giving eye contact. Now, this can be quite hard because it means looking at the camera rather than their face on the screen. And you'll see that by watching the assessor, your eyes are actually downcast. Therefore, make sure you switch between looking at them and the camera. You should also think about the positioning of your camera so that your top third can be seen. Make sure you review your background and make sure it's not more interesting than you. We've had some very interesting backdrops to some of the interviews we've completed recently, including shelves and shelves of garden gnomes behind one candidate, which can be a bit distracting when you're trying to interview someone. So just to summarise, the following are top tips from employers actually running digital assessment centres. Be upfront and honest about what you can and can't do, such as with regards to accessing devices or difficult timings. Practice with the tech. Download it a good week in advance and test it, play with it. Make sure you know how to minimise screens and mute your microphone. Use a headset and a laptop wherever possible. Now, from what I've seen, Zoom is being used a lot. It may be one to look at because thankfully it's quite easy to use as well, but there's a range of different digital platforms and the employer should let you know in advance what you'll be using. Be ready for problems. And if there does end up being issues with the technology, be prepared to have a phone call instead. The important thing is to don't let it throw you off your game, because the employer is aware that things can go wrong. Prepare your materials. So one big advantage of a digital assessment centre is that you can have some notes to hand. Now you might be able to do this via a split screen or have them pasted to the wall behind your computer. Either way, just make sure they're accessible because you don't want to be rustling through paper while you're having an interview. And lastly, stay engaged. Use all the time available in the exercises. You could show your engagement by checking your understanding of the exercise with the assessor before it begins. And remember that even if the assessor switches off their microphone and camera in an exercise, they might still be watching, listening, and assessing you. And what a lot of employers are also doing is that in between exercises, they're actually giving candidates the opportunity to ask questions to existing leaders, to apprentices and graduates who've recently started with them. So definitely take advantage of this opportunity. Hand you back to Sophie for final thoughts on assessment centres.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, so I've got some final top tips before I share with you the resources and what we're linking to this module, as well as then picking up on any final questions. So, as you can see from the information that we've shared, there are a variety of exercises and formats that the employer could choose to use. Regardless, they are all aimed at giving you an opportunity to showcase the competency, skills, or values needed for the job. For example, if the employer has said that commercial awareness is needed for the role, think about how you can demonstrate this. To stand out from the crowd, it's important that you prepare and practice, and you can do this by researching the business, delivering your presentation to others if you've been given one in advance, or practicing with the relevant technology. As I said earlier, don't dwell on any mistakes, instead concentrate on performing well in the next task. Don't worry about the other candidates, focus on putting your key skills forward. Participate in all of the exercises and look to draw others into group discussions. Understand the requirements of each task, so quickly digest the brief and then revisit it once you understand the overall challenge. And if you haven't understood anything, just ask. Display positive body language and good eye contact to build a connection with others, so that's assessors and any other candidates. And then finally, relax and let your personality shine, as the assessors do warm to individuality and you want to try and convey your true self, because that's ultimately what they are looking for. So, and if you're to join us next week or the week after, you can see what's coming up here. We have the final interview stage coming up all of next week. And then the week after, we're doing the transition into the world of work. So sign up for those if you haven't already. And as I mentioned earlier, obviously we've got the YouTube channel for any that you may have missed. In terms of resources for this session, we've got the link to Belbin there, which I mentioned earlier. Got the top tips for each exercise on these slides. I'm going to show you some case studies in a moment. I've got 2 case studies to show you of students that have been through assessment centres. Again, the career surveys, and there's the link to the book which the series is based upon. So we are a social bunch. If you're not already, we've invited you to connect with us personally. Here are the channels for SRS, link for the YouTube there. And we're using the hashtag #LockdownYourCareer for the webinar series in particular. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the case studies now. This is the first one. I will leave this up for a moment and then I'll move on to the last one and just leave those up, and we'll pick up any questions. So I'll just be quiet for a moment and let you read through this one. So just an example there of something that Rachna had been through. Move on to the next one now. Remember, you can come back to these. So I'm just going to leave this one on the screen and hand over to Helen to give us any. There seems to have been quite a lot of flashing, so I don't know whether you've had lots of questions or if there's any outstanding questions.
Yeah, we've had a few, so I've hopefully kept on top of most of them. I just left a couple to the end there because I thought by the time I finished typing my response, I could just talk about it instead. So we've had a question there. What is the best way to act in a group exercise when numerous members of the group are trying to be the leader? So this happens quite a bit. Everyone wants to talk at once. Everyone wants to be the key facilitator. So it's important to take on a particular role in that respect, and you don't want to interrupt people, but at the same time, if everyone is being quite aggressive and bossy, you may have to politely interrupt and encourage contributions from quieter members. Just because someone is a leader does not mean that they will get through to the next stage or be successful. Sometimes it's the people who talk the most aren't successful, because I've assessed some candidates in group exercises who actually have made a limited contribution, but the contribution they have made was really valuable. Great ideas. They actually took the time to consider the brief and give a very good idea, and also made the effort to include quieter members. It's things like that that really stand out more than someone who's really trying to dominate the discussion. And Sophie mentioned earlier as well, Belvin team roles. It is one to have a look into, and you'll be able to get a clear picture of what role particularly applies to you and how you fit in with the different 9 fundamental team roles that there are. Would you add anything with that, Sophie?
No, I think that's a good response.
We've got another question here as well. How to stop dwelling on any mistakes I made. I had an interview some time ago and I noticed myself thinking about things I said wrong. You're not alone in that. I don't know of anyone who hasn't come out of an interview and thought, oh, I should have said that, I could have said that differently, I forgot to mention that. And you tie yourself in knots about it sometimes, and it's important to kind of draw a line under it. But before you do, every interview I've come out of, I have thought about some of the questions that I struggled with, made a note of them, and thought about how I'd answer that next time so that I felt a bit more prepared for my next interview. And also take the time to jot down what you thought you did really well, because there will have been things that you have done well, and it's important to reflect on them. It's much easier to draw out the things you would have liked to have done better, but just take a bit of time after the interview to kind of pat yourself on the back for the questions you do think you did well at.
I would just add to that make sure you get the feedback. Often when people think they've been unsuccessful, or even if you have been unsuccessful and you've been told you haven't progressed to the next stage or got the job, people feel really crappy when you don't, it's a rejection ultimately, but you've got to ask for the feedback, even though it feels even more painful and a bit more kind of rubbing salt in the wound. Because if you don't ask for feedback, then you're making assumptions about the questions that you've not answered right, or the exercises you've not done so well in, and actually you might be wrong, or there might be, as Helen said, it's important to recognise the bits you have done well, so the feedback will hopefully be balanced and show you some of the stuff you've done well as well. And if there's bits that you've done well that you haven't picked up on yourself, it's useful to have that. So even though it's not necessarily fun hearing feedback, they'll do it with kindness. So make sure you get it and reflect on it and learn from it.
Yeah, and the same person just put that they meant that they get hung up on having said the wrong thing actually in the interview. So between questions, try to move on. So once you've answered that question, and just focus on that next question, take one at a time. And then when it gets to the end of the interview, if it's really playing on your mind that you feel you didn't answer a particular question very well, they're always going to say to you, have you got any further questions? And you might have, we've covered this in an earlier webinar about some killer questions that you might want to go through with, but it's also the opportunity for you to say, actually, could I go back to an earlier question where I would like to, I'd like to refer to something, another experience, as I feel that I have more information to offer in this area. There is the opportunity to do that, and to go back to that question.
Well, we're covering, so interviews, usually you will probably get an interview within an assessment centre, and we're covering interviews in a lot more detail next week because we're focusing on the final interview, whether that be within an assessment centre or as a standalone thing. So if that's an area that you want to learn about, join us next week for sure.
Yeah. And in terms of how do you get feedback from the assessment centre, it will be, you won't be able to get it on the day. Well, I certainly haven't heard of any assessment centres where you get it on the day because they need time to process it and collate it. But after, when you receive the results of the assessment centre, whether you've passed or you haven't, they should share the feedback with you. And if you have passed and you are successful, still ask for feedback, because it's good to know what you could have done better and what actually you did really well at. Because people tend to only ask for feedback and when they haven't passed. I think it's good to get it regardless.
Agreed.
Yeah. I think that's all the questions there. Certainly, if anyone thinks of anything at a later date, please feel free to link in with us and ask any questions there. We've also got a short survey after this webinar. It's very, very quick to do, literally take you 2 minutes, just to give us some feedback on how you feel webinar was.
If anyone's still on, one thing I would love to see in the survey, and we are asking you to complete it after each webinar, so it is for a different topic, but in the box where you can write anything, I'd love to hear if anyone's got any ideas about future webinars in terms of content of stuff that we haven't covered or we're not planning to cover, just any other ideas where you think, oh, it'd be really good if they could do a webinar on this. Because I'm already kind of thinking about, you know, once this series is over, future ideas and things like that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about anything that you think would be useful. That would be really interesting. Okay, great.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you. See you next time.